And now joining us is a man that covers the Philadelphia Eagles for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and that's Zach Berman. Zach, it's Zach Gelb and Chase Sr. How you doing today?
Doing great. Glad to be on your show, guys.
Well, thank you for coming on, and I know I ran into you a few weeks ago down at Radio Row for the Super Bowl, and then a few days afterwards at Pietro's on Walnut Street, so I didn't get a chance to see what you were eating that night. What did you have at Pietro's?
I had the rigatoni vodka and pizza. It's a good spot there. I like it.
That's why I like you, because I'm a big rigatoni alla vodka guy myself, and I also like their pizza there, so I can see why we do get along. But the Eagles, the big news today, Riley Cooper back in a 5-year, $25 million deal. We all know that it was imperative for the Eagles to go out there and re-sign Riley because of the trust that he has with Nick Foles. So just give us your take on the contract.
Yeah, I disagree. I didn't think it was imperative to sign him. Clearly, the Eagles thought so, and the Eagles are in that business. So I give them credit for this. Their valuation of him had to be right on, because for a player who's an unrestricted free agent to sign a week before hitting the open market, it really shows you kind of the mutual understanding of how that player's valued. It's $10 million guaranteed, so it's not a ridiculous amount of money, but it is. You're paying him starting receiver money, which is interesting because he basically had 1 year where he was playing at that level, and they need to believe that he's more than a replacement level player. So it's going to be fascinating to watch, but you are correct in that he was an important target for Nick Foles. So the way those two play together, when Foles being the starting quarterback next year, it certainly helps from a continuity perspective.
You look at Riley Cooper, like you mentioned, he had a career year this year, had 8 touchdowns, over 800 yards, and he hasn't really been that productive in his other 3 years in the National Football League. We all know what happened in the summer with him using the N-word, and he did mess up, but I didn't think he was supposed to be cut from the team, and the Eagles stuck with him and trusted him, and he's really come a long way, and he's progressed here with the Eagles.
Yeah, you're right about that. And regarding what happened during the summer, I don't want to say it was brushed over, but the organization was firm that they were committed to him, and he's obviously a valuable player, and he responded with the best year of his career. So within that, I do think there was an element of that in him returning to Philadelphia, in that this is a locker room that knows him, accepts him. If you sign somewhere else, you need to go into a different locker room and prove yourself there. So I suppose there's an element to that, but this was a football decision. And it's not just the statistical production with him, but he's very valuable as a blocker, and that's something that Chip Kelly really values on the edge.
Zach Berman of the Philadelphia Inquirer joins us on the hotline, Philly's #1 college radio station, WHIP. Zach, it's Chase. How much did the growing affection and the need for a big-body wide receiver who can catch that back shoulder fade help the market value for Riley Cooper in this deal?
That's a good point. It certainly helps. I know it's a factor with the Eagles because they don't have a lot of those body types atop their depth chart at wide receiver. And if you look at the way the league's going, teams need that type of player. That being said, the draft is loaded with those types of players. So I thought going into the offseason, the Eagles weren't going to pay a dollar more than what Cooper was valued at. And frankly, I think the contract, when you look at the guarantees, is fair in that regard. I thought they were going to get a big receiver in the draft. They still very well might, but Cooper's value as that big receiver is certainly important.
With re-signing Cooper, Kelsey, and Peters, where do you think this leaves Jeremy Maclin? Because a few teams are interested in him. He's stated that he wants to stay with the Eagles, and he could certainly flourish in this Chip Kelly system.
Yeah, I don't think this affects Jeremy per se. I can tell you there's mutual interest in Jeremy returning, and I think he's going to. The one factor that today matters is not the Eagles having money, but the Eagles clearly value Riley Cooper at a certain price, at a 5-year, $25 clip with 10 guaranteed. Jeremy's not get a 5-year deal; he'll get a 1-year deal. The question is how much is in that 1-year deal. I'd be surprised if he gets less annually than what Cooper got. So I think that's the only wrinkle there. But from what I was from my understanding all along, this was not an either-or proposition. So it wasn't either Macklin or Cooper.
I agree with you. I think Macklin's going to be back on a one-year deal as Zach Berman joins us right now here on the main event, Philly's #1 college radio station, WHIP. But it's very important to bring back Macklin because you look at 2004 when they brought in Terrell Owens, they didn't have a lot of great wide receivers around T.O., and it did hurt them. I know they got to a Super Bowl, but in that Super Bowl, the Patriots just said, hey, T.O., go out there, and it was under some big-time injuries, but they only really let T.O. make a play, and none of the other receivers really did step up. And you look at this offense now, it's explosive. You have LaShawn McCoy, you have Riley Cooper, Deshaun Jackson. Bringing back a Jeremy Macklin, and if he could stay healthy, would be big because you have so many options and a really pass-heavy NFL.
Sure, you're right about that. Along those same lines, they broke the franchise record for yards in the season without Jeremy last year. You say if you add Jeremy in there, I think he'd be the best receiver on the roster in terms of sheer talent. Obviously, you need to see how he responds to the knee. The player who I don't anticipate being back is Jason Avant. And when that happens, you need to see who plays the slot. Is it going to be Macklin? Is it going to be Cooper? Both players are capable of playing in there. It is an explosive offense, but I disagree that I don't think Macklin is a necessity at the time because obviously they had that production last year without him.
Zach, with Peters coming back, he's getting the most money out of any offensive tackle who's 32 years or older, and Jason Kelce's being paid like a top 5 center. How important is it for the Eagles to bring back some of their own players and take care of business earlier on in this process, especially some of the guys that they've drafted and seen flourish with the Eagles in the beginning of their careers?
Yeah, there's a degree of value in that. I mean, I think that does matter in the locker room for this reason. Because if you say publicly that you want to build through the draft and you value your own players, you value a culture, and then you go out and you give more money to someone else than you give to your own players, all of a sudden the players in the locker room look around and say, well, is that lip service or do they really mean it? Like, I think there's a degree of validity there in terms of building a culture, establishing a culture, and even from a football perspective, understanding how the player fits. Where they went wrong with Nnamdi Asomugha was they made a poor evaluation of the player, how he fit within the scheme, and how much that player had left. With your own player, you have so much more information. So I think obviously that's a considerable factor in it. But clearly, when you look at the way the defense played, they're going to need to bring in some guys from the outside to get better.
Peters clearly had a great year this year with the Eagles, and he came back from that injury, and we know he's a tough player, but he's up there in age at 32. Were you at all surprised they didn't really just say, hey, Jason, let's wait out the rest of this season before we extend your contract?
No, I was not. I expected them actually to give Peters a deal this offseason. I didn't think it was going to be a 5-year deal, a deal as long as it was. But I am not surprised by it, and frankly, if you look at the way the deal is structured, much of that financial burden is on those first few years of the deal when you know or you have full confidence he's going to be an optimum player. So I would look at that and say I am not surprised. And frankly, it's a much better strategy than letting him play out this year and then putting a franchise tag on him next year or something of that nature, because the one thing you don't want is Jason Peters playing upset.
We're spending a few minutes with Zach Berman of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Zach, towards the end of the Andy Reid era, the reason why the Eagles weren't successful, or at least part of the reason, was because they didn't draft well. In the last couple of years, they've drafted well and brought in some players who have made some immediate impacts. This year is also an important draft because the Eagles have a lot of needs, both on the offensive side of the football and on defense. What do you expect the Eagles to do, especially earlier on in the draft in the first and second rounds?
Yeah, I would say best available players, much as that's a cliche. When you talk about the way the Eagles were burned in those previous drafts, I think it's applicable because the understanding they had is you can't reach for a need, and you never know how the roster is going to shake out. And the example I give you is when the Eagles drafted Fletcher Cox, they had all these other defensive tackles on the roster. And then all of a sudden you cut Colin Jenkins, you cut Mike Patterson, you let Derek Landry walk, and you don't have all those defensive tackles on the roster. Your depth chart can change over years. If you evaluate players correctly, you stick to your board, you're going to have the best chance of hitting on a pick. Now, the key there is obviously evaluating correctly. That being said, I do think you'll see the Eagles come out of this draft with help in the secondary, both at safety and corner. I think you'll see them add one more receiver. I do think you'll see an interior offensive lineman potentially, and I would not be surprised if they add another tight end.
You were in Indy at the Combine, and I saw a quote out there, something along the likes of, Chip Kelly actually knows the players in college better than the Philadelphia Eagles scouts, and that's because of his background in Oregon before he came over to the Philadelphia Eagles. And obviously, the players are going to change in a few years, and he's not going to be as familiar with them. But how important is Chip Kelly as a drafting figure, because he knows a lot of these players, because he's not that far removed from the college ranks?
Well, it works both ways, Zach. It helps in that for some of these guys who he recruited or who played for him, he's been in their living rooms. I mean, he sees how they are on a day-to-day basis. You know, even the best scouts don't have the same type of feel for a player as a guy you're with every day, or as a guy you recruited for 2-3 years. So yeah, that information helps. The other side of it is that it can cloud your objectivity to a certain point. I mean, the Eagles had 6 Oregon players, or the Eagles have 6 Oregon players on the roster. That's more than the amount of players that's more than the amount of Syracuse players Doug Marrone has, USC players Pete Carroll has, Stanford players Jim Harbaugh has combined. Okay, so clearly, you know, when it comes to players who played for Oregon, Chip has a certain affinity for them, how they'll fit within his scheme, how they'll fit within his locker room. And you can argue that there's a better practice squad player than Brandon Bear, or there's a better fourth receiver than Jeff Mayo, or so on and so forth. These are arguments you could have, but clearly the fact that Chip has familiarity with the player can help. So when you apply that to the draft, there's someone who Chip has seen. If there's someone who Chip knows, maybe that player gets an edge over the unknown.
Zach, there's a couple of players on the free agent market that are considered big-ticket free agents that could fill some vacancies on the defensive side of the football. Jarius Byrd, who is an Oregon guy, T.J. Ward at safety for the Browns, Brian Arakpo is an outside linebacker. He's a great pass rusher, and B.J. Raji is a really good defensive tackle. From all the impressions that I've got from Howie Roseman and his radio and television appearances is that the Eagles aren't going to spend money on some of these big free agents. Do you expect that to be the case?
Not necessarily. You know, I had an article in the Inquirer last week that, you know, where I asked Howie specifically. Well, I'll set it up this way. Howie's concern is he does not want to pay a B player A money. And I said to Howie, is there an A player who's going to be a free agent? And he said yes. And they do want to be aggressive, and they do view themselves as risk takers. The thing is, those players often don't even hit the free agent mark. So let's talk about a guy like Jarius Byrd for a second. If he's tagged or if he reaches a deal, he's not even a free agent come March 11th.
Right.
So that's the thing, is that the situation you get yourself into that you need to avoid is where you say we need to sign a safety, okay, and then Jarius Byrd and T.J. Ward don't hit the market, and you take the money you were going to pay for Ward or Byrd and you pay it to a lesser guy, and that's problematic for a team. So I think the Eagles are willing to spend on the right player. I just don't know if the right player will hit the market. Of those guys you mentioned, I don't think any of them will be an Eagle. The free agent to watch, in my opinion, is Malcolm Jenkins, safety from the New Orleans Saints. I think he could be a good fit, age-wise, scheme-wise, talent-wise.
On the way out here with Zach Berman from the Philadelphia Inquirer, does a great job covering the team. Let's just get to the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. You were at the Combine. Clowney was very impressive in the 40 time. Johnny Football could be a possible number 1 overall pick. If you had to say right now who the Texans would be taking with the number 1 overall pick, who would it be?
I wish I knew. I would lean toward either Clowney or Blake Bortles, but it's hard for me to say. And I don't cover the Texans as much. I would take Johnny Manziel.
Agreed.
Again, I'm not a coach. I'm not a GM. I'm not a scout. I just know that if you can play like that against Alabama's defense, you can play like that against NFL defense.
Did you and McClain, did you go out there and did you guys run the 40 down there in Indianapolis, or were you guys just working?
I was working literally from early morning to late night, so I did not run the 40. And had I run the 40, I think that everyone there would still be laughing. They would not be finished their work.
Well, Zach, we appreciate a few minutes today. Thanks so much, my friend, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
My pleasure, guys. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Zach Berman right there, the Philadelphia Inquirer. Gelb and Chase here with you. We'll take a quick break here on the main event, and we'll wrap up shop right after these short messages.